there are many obstacles in the world today to a peaceful and harmonious situation. The conflicts and difficulties that people engage in are both on a global level, national levels, state levels, and personal levels, organizational levels. Human beings must learn to resolve their conflicts through open and respectful communication, understanding differences, accepting differences, and finding common ground amid their unique experiences. This is true in global settings. This is true in national settings. This is true in all government, in business, and in religious organizations and spiritual organizations, and in families. When people break off communication and refuse to discuss and find common ground, then trouble arises. In all levels, this is true. So, if Mr. Trump decides he would rather slander and not communicate, not find out what it is the ones he is concerned about need and how those needs can be worked with, then what happens? A polarization happens between forces. And the people come into a situation of not talking to each other. So the United States is not talking meaningfully to North Korea, or vice versa. And North Korea, feeling threatened, will naturally continue to defend itself as it feels is most effective. And the more desperate they become, the more likely they are to develop arms and to use them. The more fearful the United States becomes of losing its power or of destruction by the emergence of power of this unknown they are not talking to, the more they act in aggressive fashion. So, with these two forces, unwilling to talk, there is a tension that must find a resolve. Either they will talk or something else will happen, isn't it? The same happens in all human relations, in different groups, spiritual groups, companies, organizations. When one party refuses to talk to another and starts instead to form a collective negative opinion, the gap grows, and it will continue to grow because of the lack of viable communication. And in the place of that viable communication, whether it be on this international level or on a very personal organizational level, the lack of viable communication leads to distrust. Even in families, this happens. And so you have a family feud for 20 years. People do not talk to each other. And when that happens, each side begins to develop a story about the other side. In a national level, in an organizational level, in a personal family level, this can happen. And that story becomes more and more real. It gains life. So the negative story about other that maintains the lack of communication, the lack of respectful inquiry and effort to resolve differences, that story becomes, it gains solidity over time in the minds of the people who believe it. And so human beings divide each other. There becomes I and my group, and then the other. And in that gap, the other is demonized in some way, slandered in some way, because there is no communication to bridge that gap and find the common humanity and loving kindness. This is a spiritual deficit. When this occurs, be it in international relations, national relations, companies, spiritual organizations, or families, it is the same dynamic.
Battery 100%.
It is the same dynamic either way. Can you hear?
Yes.
Is it still going?
Yeah.
All right.
Govinda joined, but he made some noise and he's not now. Yeah.
All right. So, there is a problem. And the problem occurs repeatedly on all levels. The problem comes when either both sides or one side unilaterally decides to break off communications, they cannot find a common denominator, and the human connectedness is broken. Why is it that human beings can own other people as slaves and feel no remorse or sadness, yet they are so loving to their own children and their friends and families, to their own community, yet they see the other as below them, and they treat another in ways that are utterly cruel. So they have two standards, one for the people they feel are part of their group, and another for the group that they have a lesser opinion of. Why? Because they have not bridged that gap of communication and found the common denominator. And instead, they have woven a story, a belief about who they are and who the other is. And so slavery becomes acceptable to human beings. Those human beings who accepted slavery are no different than other people. The only difference is that they did not communicate and find their common humanity with those they considered slaves, and they accepted the group story about the other. And so they joined into it. And so their actions were cruel. And today, someone may judge them, saying, how can such people be that way? But they are no different than anyone else. They just accepted the group norm. And they divided the other and did not bridge that gap of humanity to find their commonality. People can do highly cruel things to other people who they consider not a part of their group, not a part of their community, and whom they attribute negative traits to. In the case of slavery, they attribute traits of not completely human, maybe lazy, maybe completely different, so they can separate and project. But in the case of international relations, it's a very foreign country. We don't understand those people. They are different. They're crazy. So the North Korean leader thinks that Mr. Trump is crazy. Mr. Trump thinks that he is crazy. Why? They don't talk to each other. Someone should lock them for 3 weeks in a room together and then see what happens. But they are not unlike many other people. This is what I'm saying. They are not like many other people. Do the same thing. Perhaps not as flagrantly as those two gentlemen. They're very outrageous in their words. Some people are a bit more dignified in their words. But the judgments the feeling of them and us, the unwillingness to open honest and viable communication and see the needs and feelings of another. Those are common traits, shared in all conflict situations. Conflict arises not simply because there are different intentions, but because the parties refuse to understand each other, refuse to communicate, want to dominate. One party over another wants to dominate rather than communicate. They can dominate by silence, not having any interaction. They can dominate by blasting with interactions that are non-communicative. But most of all, the dominance comes because the group that is identified, whether it's a nation or a family or an organization, gets in a collective idea, belief about the one they don't communicate with. And they sustain it. It becomes self-perpetuating. And the longer it goes on, the wider the gap, the more embedded and enmeshed the belief systems become. And so the two parties become hostile. They can have a war of words, a war of silence, or a war of violent actions. But all are wars. So what to do when such divisions occur? Someone should attend to the cat.
If they're out.
What to do when such divisions occur? Usually they cannot be resolved by the parties themselves because they become very invested in the stories, their separate stories about each other, their separate negative stories. And the only real solution lies in breaking down those stories with truth, in listening to the needs of the other. If the United States listened to the needs of North Korea to be recognized, to feel secure, and if North Korea listened to the needs of the United States to feel safe, and to have a strong hold on world politics for its own security, the two perhaps could find a meeting ground. And as they began to respectfully talk to each other and interact, meet the other's needs, compromise a bit, perhaps they would grow more similar. The cultural integration would begin to occur, and the tension diffuse. But as long as North Korea will only build missiles to keep itself safe by being able to destroy the United States will not listen. Their approach is faulty. As long as the United States will not listen to the demands and needs of North Korea for respect and assistance to get them on the right way, North Korea will become more and more an outlaw. If they cannot find a good path, they will find any path. If they cannot be praised and brought into the fold of international relations, they will become an outlaw, and they will act as an outlaw. So both sides refuse this viable communication, and thus a situation of great strain has been created. This dynamic is very common, as I have said, in all levels of human interactions. If the parties will allow a third party to come and to assist them to break down the barriers, the negative beliefs towards each other they have set up, and the self-defensive, aggressive actions, then slowly communication can form, and integration becomes a possibility. The other option is oppression, one dominating the other, or a Cold War standoff. This conflict resolution is an essential need in human society. And when two parties have become set in their negative beliefs towards each other and in their aggressive actions towards each other, or their unwillingness to talk to each other, it becomes necessary to have an intermediary. But both must accept the authority of the intermediary. Human beings have the tendency to revert to aggression and self-defense when they feel threatened. They have the tendency to identify with a group and a group dynamic, and to create a situation of them and us, where there is a defensive demeanor towards other. So this groupism, this identity with one's primary group, be it a nation, an organization, or a family, as opposed to an other, becomes the source of struggle, discord, and violence. All too common in human society. Human beings have made efforts over the millenniums to control violence. But those efforts have not been successful. And war has been a part of human society. Wars in families, between clans, between tribes, between nations. On small scales and on large. Efforts to do harm to the other, to secure one's position, are always there. Efforts to dominate and oppress other with one's own position. This is a part of the change taking place in the world today. Under stress and strain, these primal tendencies of human beings increase as fear increases in the minds of people. In the transitions of the world today, there is a movement away from the prior aggressiveness into a world of communication and interwoven connectedness. But in this movement, there is also resistance and struggle. And today's situation reflects that struggle. Old ways rise to the surface when people feel afraid. And great destruction can ensue. The solutions lie in viable, compassionate communication, in the effort to understand each other and to find the common humanity and loving kindness within the hearts of each, rather than to reinforce the separate stories about the faults and failings of the other. Right? These things come in everyone's life, not only in the lives of nations, but of people, ordinary people. Each person struggles within themselves with these very tendencies. But as mind grows in magnitude and one comes closer to divinity, there is less tendency in these directions. But there are times in the spiritual path where these tendencies rise up. To be worked with. These are primal tendencies of the human mind and the human society. But they need not dominate the human society. And there will come a time when war is a thing of the past and human beings will not resort to these violence and the type of psychology that causes violence. All right? Are there any questions?
I think, Baba, in this process of communication, I found it very extremely important, and particularly nonviolent communication. However, if there are two parties, countries, organizations, families, as you mentioned, and one side shows unwillingness to communicate, the other is willing to communicate, how that bridge between this kind of very opposing forces can minimize so the other party will be willing to come on the table and communicate. We sometimes see this extreme, one is aggressive energy more, the other is kind of subordinate to that.
It happens always. One can be that both refuse communication. One can be that one party doesn't see the value of communication. Usually the party that has the dominant position will not see the value of communication. So it is the United States that withdraws from communication. Usually the dominant party, the one that feels strongest, feels they can succeed in not communicating. Mm-hmm. They will use that. It is a form of aggression. Mm-hmm. But that is why I say a mediation, a third party, is sometimes needed. Mm-hmm. So the courts of law have developed because there are so many disputes between people. And they cannot find a common denominator. If there were a court of law to take Trump and North Korea to, that would be good.
I like the idea of putting them together in a room. Making them stay.
Yes, they would benefit from that. So there is no simple solution. One party cannot force another party that doesn't wish to cooperate. So there needs to be two parties willing to cooperate. Education of people is important. Ignorance plays a big part in the aggressive behaviors of people, that they do not, they are unconscious about their judgments, unconscious about their aggression. So education can play an important part. Also, if they see some value to them, they will sometimes come around. Once they become more conscious, and compassion binds them, they will come round. You see people who have had change of heart, they have become compassionate. They've realized the error of their ways. But most of all, what is not present in today's world is a societal norm, a standard of compassionate communication, of willing, where it becomes societally unacceptable to engage in these various dominance behaviors and violent behaviors. That will happen. And these tendencies of human beings will be regulated. But in today's world, that is not the case. And there is no simple solution. Education is foremost. And from education, establishing mechanisms within the society, be it global, organizational, or family. So today, if there's a family squabble and the two parties can't talk, they just stop talking to each other. They don't communicate, and both parties may suffer greatly. But if the norm of the society is, you not only is it suggested that you seek some counseling, some intermediate to facilitate the communication, but that it is required, then you will find that the people, and not only required, it is socially unacceptable to act the other way, to demonize the one you don't like and to justify your mean actions. That if that becomes socially unacceptable, and there is very strong effort for mediation, then vast majority of problems will find a peaceful solution with the maximum amount of harmony that can be had. Why would society change to those directions from what it is currently? You must ask yourself that. All right.